Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is all about my 10 most loved books, which I thought was appropriate given that it is the season of love. And although I think Valentine's Day is overly commercialized at this point, it's nice to talk about things that have meaning to you and that you appreciate. So these are the books that I would give an arm or a leg to read for the first time once again, books that I've reread in some cases multiple times, and books that have just left a lasting impression on me over the years. They're across a variety of genres, so why don't we just get started? The books I'm about to talk about are in no particular order, but the first one I want to touch upon is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and this is a book that is both historical fiction and fantasy because there is a time travel element, although it is mythical in nature. And the protagonist, or at least one of them, is a World War II nurse who inadvertently travels from the 1940s to 18th century Scotland, kind of with the Jacobite rebellion in the not-so-distant future, and she is forced to marry this Highland warrior, but she's already married in her present, the 1940s, so she's grappling with her love for her present husband and her husband of the 18th century, and I am completely team Jamie and Claire, but this book was amazing. I fell in love with it. It's probably going to be on my channel quite a bit this month because I am trying to reread book one so that I can continue with other books in the series. One of the things that this book made me realize is that I knew a lot of history kind of from the perspective of the British, but this was a book that really had a lot of sympathy for the underdogs, the Scots, and it made me very curious about the Jacobite Rebellion. This book was part of the reason I went to Scotland in 2016 and fell in love with the country, and I just loved this story. I loved the many layers of it, I loved the characters and the romance, and I particularly loved that it felt so well researched. So this is a book that definitely holds a special place in my heart. The next book is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, and this book wrecked me in the best possible way. The writing in this I can't do justice to. It is just breathtaking and so profound and just beautiful. There are passages about the desert in particular that just there's nothing like them. There's nothing to compare. But this is a story largely about four individuals from different countries, cultures, religions, and political backgrounds who find themselves having to coexist in this Italian villa during the Italian campaign of World War II. And they're largely brought there because one of the characters, a young woman, Hannah, is treating this English patient who is badly burned and on his deathbed and can't remember his name. And while he's slowly dying in this villa, he's on morphine, he's slowly revealing bits and pieces of his past. And it's just beautiful hearing about these different individuals and their lives and seeing them coexisting in this way at this moment when the world is literally at war. And I just have to say, this is probably one of the most passionate books I've ever read. There's a particular scene about the hollow in a woman's neck that is probably the most erotic and equally most romantic thing I have ever read, and I will never look at the hollow in my neck the same way again. It's just, the writing in this is just breathtaking. The imagery and descriptions of the desert are just unreal. And yes, it is literary fiction, so I would say that it isn't a necessarily straightforward or fast-moving read, but it makes up for it with heart. The emotions that are being described are just so profound, and everything that is being said and depicted and shown about these individuals is just so touching and heartfelt, and it's just a great book. Okay, the next book I feel like would be a surprise if I hadn't already called it my favorite book of all time in my small booktuber tag video, but that is The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. And this book is fantasy, and it's high fantasy at that. It is Arthurian legend with King Arthur, Excalibur, the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot. It is essentially a retelling of all of that through the perspectives of the women of the story. So Morgan Le Fay, King Arthur's mother and her sisters, one of whom is the Lady of the Lake, Guinevere, Elaine, and many others. And the real focal point of this story is Morgan Le Fay, who I feel like is the character that Arthurian legend does dirty to. She is oftentimes portrayed as just downright evil and one-dimensional, and this book really makes her this full-bodied, multi-dimensional character, and she's neither good nor bad. She's really just trying to preserve her culture, this pagan, Celtic, druid type culture, and this ability to kind of live in the gray area is what I feel like this book does really well. There are a lot of characters that are ambiguous, and that makes them very realistic, and it's very hard to say whether a character is good or bad entirely, or to say that something is right or wrong entirely. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, which I didn't really understand when I first read it many years ago, was the conflict between the pagan religion and the early Christian religion that is going on in this book. It felt very well researched to me and was just this fascinating struggle of the pagans trying to preserve their culture and the early Christian faith beginning to kind of become more popular and almost make paganism disappear in a lot of senses and ways. Senses is not, I can't talk, but you get what I'm saying. It's just a really beautiful book. It is rather long, but I highly recommend it, especially if you're into Arthurian legend or like high fantasy. It was really the first book of its kind that I can think of, at least, and reminds me of another book that I'll talk about later in this video. So, while The Mists of Avalon might have surprised some, the next book definitely will not. And that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which has made many an appearance on this channel already. And this is a modern Gothic novel. The main character is never given a name, but she is a young, naive girl, essentially, who marries the more worldly Maxim de Winter and returns with him to his ancestral home, where she has to live with the specter, the ghost of his first wife, who has died. And this book, the writing draws me in every single time. It has one of my favorite first lines in literature, and I just love the way that the psychology of the main character is described. And this is just a book that has so many rich layers to it that I can't put it down. It's a sort of book that I feel like I could write dozens of papers on, and for me, that is the sign of a good book, when it keeps me thinking. The sort of climax and the resolution of the book are just like, they hit you in the gut and they are so good. I'm not going to tell you what they are because that would spoil the surprise, but they're just wonderful. So if you're going to read it, just know that. But it really is just a stunning book that I will return to time and time again. So there you have it. The next book, also not a surprise to anyone because I literally gush about this author in probably 90% of my videos at this point. But it is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, and to be honest, all of the Sarah Waters books that I've read to this point are up there for me, but this one is just chef's kiss. It is another gothic novel. A thief gets involved in this scam to basically steal a rich girl's money by marrying her off to a con man who will then throw her in an asylum and take her money for himself. And there are just a ton of plot twists that caught me off guard in the best way. The atmosphere here was just absolutely stunning. You felt like you were living in Victorian England at the time. And to be honest, as someone who studied Victorian literature and Gothic literature in particular, this does such a phenomenal job of capturing the very spirit of the traditional Gothic novel and updating it. It uses many of the devices and trappings, the virginal maiden, the predatory male, asylums, manors, just to name a few, but it does it in a new and interesting way, in my opinion. If you like Gothic literature, if you like things that are a little bit darker in tone, if you really enjoy being surprised by books, I think this one is for you. It's just amazing how much intensity and how much surprise can be in one book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The only thing I would say is that, like most Sarah Waters books, potentially all Sarah Waters books, it does start out slower. So you do kind of have to wait for the build because there's a lot of character development and world building to give you that atmosphere, but the payoff is well worth it. The next book is Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. It was bone-achingly good. The writing was beautiful. The characters were so well developed, which I thought was so impressive, given that this book is, I don't think 300 pages long, covers 10 generations within a family, and each character only has a chapter. And somehow you have these full-bodied characters that pull at your heartstrings. It is a multi-generational story that starts out in Ghana and is literally following two lines of the same family, these two half-sisters who don't know each other, and their descendants. And it covers so much ground historically, from talking about the slave trade and colonization, to talking about slavery in the United States, to the convict leasing during the Reconstruction, the Harlem Renaissance, the civil rights movement, and just so much more. It really does give you this panoramic view of Black history in a way, and it does so in this way that is both beautiful and also deeply upsetting, because you see the trials and tribulations of these individuals. But it really was just a stunning book to read. I read it as part of a book club, and we all were just emotionally destroyed in the best possible way, because it made us so empathetic with these characters and everything that they went through. And yeah, some parts of it are difficult to swallow because they are so upsetting, but that I feel like that's what people need sometimes, and it does that so well. So yeah, I would recommend this book to anyone, as it would literally any of these books here, but this one in particular just feels very, very timely, and it handles the history of slavery, those people who remained in Africa and those who come here and their ancestors, in this really captivating way. And it really is just a book that oozes empathy and makes you think, and that is what I'm here for. The next book is The Door by Magda, Szabo, which is translated from Hungarian. And the way that I discovered this book is a bit of a journey, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Basically, I stan Helen Mirren and want to be her when I grow up, and so I watch any and everything that she's in, and I happened to be scrolling through Amazon Prime when this movie with her in it called The Door, obviously based on this book, appeared. I watched the movie, really enjoyed it, and was just like, I need to read the book, which is par for the course in Brittany land. But I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the writing style, but I will say that it is a quiet book in a lot of ways, because it really is a book about the relationship between this curmudgeon of a housekeeper, Emerence, and the posh writer who employs her to keep house. And what is so interesting about this book is that you know how it ends from the start. You know that Emerence has died, and you know that the author blames herself. But you don't know how Emerence has died or why the writer feels guilt for it. And so the book itself is literally telling you the history of their relationship and slowly unfurling the secret behind this death and the source of guilt. And it is just so captivating and so unique in that way that I fell in love with it. And it's certainly a book that I want to reread, but I also want to read other books by Magda, Szabo. I currently own one other book of hers, but this is just a fascinating look at a relationship between these two women. And it's not a romantic relationship, let's just put that out there, but it is a relationship with many nuances and a fascinating history. So yeah, that's why I love this book. Okay, the next book is one that was also a favorite of 2020 for me, and that is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. The prose in this was absolutely stunning. It still haunts me and still resonates with me, and I honestly have not been able to stop thinking of this book since I read it. It is a feminist retelling of the Iliad, which makes me think of the Mists of Avalon, which is a feminist retelling of Arthurian legend. But in this, Briseis is taken captive as a war trophy and becomes the concubine of Achilles. And it's really exploring what it means to be a woman living through a war, because these are women who have had to abandon their past lives and are now slaves to the very men who slaughtered their fathers, husbands, brothers, sons, etc. This is not an easy book emotionally. These women are brutalized physically, mentally, emotionally, and it just is bone-achingly good in a sense, because it gives a voice to these characters in the Iliad that wouldn't really even warrant a mention in many cases. So in that regard, I found it fascinating too. And I'm not someone who has an affinity for antiquity or Greco-Roman historical fiction, but this won me over, and the fact that Pat Barker has another book in a similar vein coming out later this year gives me life. The next book is a Russian classic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. And I reread this in December, so I go into more detail about the book in my December wrap-up, which I'll link for you. But this book is the reason I fell in love with Russian literature and Russian history, and why I went on to study it in school. I think what fascinates me about this book is that despite kind of its prevalence as this high literary masterpiece by many, and why so many are intimidated by it, this is a book that's dealing with something that everyone can relate to. It's dealing with family, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's dealing with the achievements of families and the disappointments within them, and it's doing that by exploring these three interconnected families. It's just a beautiful look at human nature and how, in many ways, people have remained the same. So that's really all I have to say on that, but don't be intimidated by it. It is really a fascinating book, and I reread this as part of a buddy read with Katie over at Katie Reads and Rants, and we just took it like 40-50 pages a day and we were done in a few weeks. So it really is something that can be tackled. But yes, that's my feelings on that. I love it. It'll probably show up on this channel again and again and again. The final book is, I think, probably the first play that I'm talking about on my channel, and that is Cat on a Hot Tin Roof by Tennessee Williams. And I first fell in love with this play because I saw the film adaptation, which I think is from 1956 and stars Elizabeth Taylor as Maggie the cat. And that version is beautiful, but it is sterilized in comparison to the actual play itself. But up until the point, I think really the only plays I had tried to read were the Shakespearean ones in school. So this opened up a whole lot of doors for me. And this is essentially the story of this couple who are going through some serious marital problems, who unfortunately have to go to Big Daddy's birthday, and so they end up having to spend the weekend in this pressure cooker of a situation with all of their relatives, while also trying to deal with what's going on in their own lives. And there's so many raw emotions that are here, so many complex characters. The dialogue is just so smart, and I just loved every minute of it. This was the play that made me fall in love with Tennessee Williams. This was why I ended up doing my senior thesis on Tennessee Williams and actually went on to read his entire bibliography. Of all the plays, this is the one that really holds a special place in my heart, and I've reread multiple times. And that's a wrap. Those are my 10 most loved books of all time. If the house was burning down, those are the ones I would try to save because they do mean the world to me. I do hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Bye!